Okay, good evening, comrades. Welcome to the latest one of the Labour Left Alliance education sessions. And for the past couple of months, we've been looking at the topic of revolution and counter-revolution in the 20th century. And we've looked at some of the major movements in fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and obviously the issue of the Russian Revolution and Stalinism. But this evening, I'm very pleased to welcome Daniel Lazare, who is an American comrade, but is actually speaking to us from Paris, just to show how internationalist we all are. And Daniel's going to talk about America in this period, 1918 to 1939. And we gave him the title, Revolutionary Challenges and Capitalist Responses. And I also suggested that he might want to talk about the New Deal and so on, but obviously what Daniel will cover will be his own concern. But I think for many people in Britain and maybe in the rest of Europe, developments in the United States in that period are often not widely understood. I think some of us have some sort of knowledge of the socialist movement of the Wobblies and of syndicalism, and of some developments on the left, and obviously the New Deal is known, but its nature and perhaps more importantly, the type of struggles that went with it are generally, I think, not widely known. And I think it's quite important for us to understand that. I think there's another reason why I would like to talk a little more about the New Deal is, of course, that it's very much in the news with President Biden's new economic package, with people arguing that this sort of harks back to that. Now, whether it does or not, I don't know. But I think understanding what is one of the world's dominant power, I think is very important for socialists. Anyway, that's enough from me. So I'll hand over to Daniel. We'll have the usual pattern. Daniel will speak for around about 45 minutes, and then we'll take questions and contributions. We'll group them together, and then Daniel can respond. Okay, thanks, Daniel.
All right, great. So, so by the period we're covering is 1980 to 1939, 1918 to 1939, 21 years in all. And it's a very, it's a crucial period because the US was already a major industrial power by that point. I think that by 1920, the US accounted for 40% of global manufacturing capacity. So it was obviously a behemoth. And then the 1920s were shaped by the capitalist boom, which was centered in the United States, and then of course which then ended with an amazing, fantastic, powerful crash in New York in October 1929, and which led to 4 years of 3.5 years of really savage depression, followed by the advent of Franklin D. Roosevelt, the famous New Deal, and as I'll argue, the development of a sort of a very new kind of consumer capitalism, which would become hegemonic after World War II. So what we're going to see, what we're going to discuss is the repression of 1919 to 1920, the arrival of the boom years, and a deep right-wing atmosphere, although not fascist, but still extremely right-wing and suffocating, and then followed by the economic collapse and a revival of the left in the form of the Popular Front led by the Communist Party and the New Deal of FDR, and out of that a new variation on the theme of capitalism. And I also want to stress, since this is America, we're talking about now the world hegemon. I want to stress all that's uniquely American about this period, and not to suggest in any sense whatsoever any concept of American exceptionalism, because America was still subject to the same capitalist laws as every other such power. But America is a very different kind of political culture, and the answers it came up to these problems turned out to be very different as well. So let me begin with a quick sketch of what happened in 1918 to 1920. It was a tumultuous period, which saw major labor upsurges, most notably the 1919 steel strike in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but really savage bourgeois repression, really so savage that it really bears comparison with what happened in Italy during the same period, leading to Mussolini's seizure of power in 1922. I mean, it's a case of it's fascism without the obvious overt fascism, but it was fascism everything but. I mean, the 1919 steelworkers strike was crushed quite brutally. The summer of 1919 saw 36 major race riots erupt across the country: Chicago, Washington, D.C., many other cities as well. And when I say race riots, what they really were white supremacist pogroms against Black people. And they were quite savage. Blacks were not passive victims. Many of them were Army veterans returning from World War I, and they armed themselves and fought back. But the violence was ferocious. It was largely one way. The casualties, Black casualties were far greater than white casualties. And it was a massive pogrom in the classic sense of the term. And 1920 also saw the Palmer raids, in which 3,000 people were arrested and nearly 600 deported. They were carried out. Palmer was the Attorney General under Woodrow Wilson, and Woodrow Wilson, who at this point was crippled by a stroke. He spent the last 18 months of his presidency virtually, completely out of it. His wife essentially ran the government, but apparently at one point Wilson called over Palmer, motioned him to come close, and whispered in his ear, "Don't allow the country to turn red." And with those words of instruction, Palmer unleashed a series of raids and deportations, which had a devastating effect on the American left. In 1920, Eugene V. Debs, the leader of the U.S. Socialist Party, was also jailed for making an anti-war speech. And the Wobblies were also massacred in the state of Washington, I believe in 1919. And so it was really a ferocious wave of repression, which sent the left wing reeling. But what made it even more devastating, of course, was the boom that set in 1920. And the boom was one of the most powerful ever seen in the history of capitalism. Capital flowed into New York because investment prospects were just zooming. And incomes rose, although of course they did not rise for workers so much as they rose for the middle and upper classes. It was a powerful boom that swept everyone into it and sort of confirmed and deepened the overall right-wing atmosphere. And I just want to, I don't know if people here read American literature, but there are two terrific novels by a writer named Sinclair Lewis. One was called Babbitt, and the other was called Main Street, written in 1920 and 1922. Really captured the poisonous, suffocating atmosphere at the time. I'll put them up on the chat right now so people can check them out. These are really this is top-notch literature as well as politically quite revealing. Main Street, I believe, bears comparison with Madame Bovary. It's really of that quality, but it really shows this incredible suffocating atmosphere. And then also there, in some of Hemingway's short stories or his novel The Sun Also Rises, there are also sort of like suggestions that the Americans that Hemingway was portraying were fleeing a deadly suffocating political atmosphere back in the U.S. So this atmosphere of Babbittry just continued and deepened through the 1920s, had the effect of marginalizing the left all the more. So what the repression of 1918 to 1920 didn't accomplish, the boom of 1920 to 29 did, and the left was left hanging by its fingernails. This is especially the case for the Communist Party and what little was left of the Socialist Party at the time. So the crash came in October 29, and the U.S. was the impact in the U.S. was devastating. The U.S. The U.S. and Germany were the two hardest hit countries, and their unemployment soared to over 25%. Wages were slashed repeatedly. The stock market itself lost 80% of its value. The middle class was devastated. The working class was even more devastated. And there were attempts to fight back, but they never got anywhere. And of course, they were hampered by the third period ultra leftism of the Communist Party at this time, which eschewed any kind of cooperation with the Socialist Party, and which rejected any cooperation with the established labor unions as a kind of a social fascism. So the few small strikes were organized, but due to the horrendous conditions and the destructive political policies of the Comintern, they were quickly crushed. Which brings us to what I think is in some ways the most important part of the story, which is March, early 1933, when two of the world's most important personalities took power at the time. One was Adolf Hitler, who became chancellor on January 30th, 1933, and the other was FDR, who became president. He took office actually on March 3rd, I think it was, in 1933. So just a little over a month later. And I want to discuss the New Deal, but I want to discuss it in a way that it's not usually discussed, and that is to discuss it in internationalist terms, and especially to compare the U.S. response under FDR to the German response under Hitler. And I think if we do that, we'll see the New Deal in a very different light. The New Deal, by the way, is a beloved experience in the eyes of left liberals and ex-communists with a capital C, because they saw the U.S. as the U.S. FDR marshaling federal power in a concerted left-wing way. And that legend continues to the present time. I mean, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, whom some of you may have heard of, has called for a Green New Deal, a New Deal that would address the issue of climate change, and that slogan has really caught on. It's endorsed by virtually the entire left, for example, there's a guy named Bob Pollan, who is a well-known left-wing economist who published a very good article in the Boston Review recently about the economy. But he ends with a peroration to the New Deal, which is really typical of how American left liberals and even some Marxists view that period. Pollan writes, focusing on the United States, one can readily envision how a reimagined New Deal, indeed what has come to be called a Green New Deal, can work. The centerpiece must be a massive government-led investment program focused on supplanting our existing fossil fuel-dominated energy system that is destroying the planet with a clean energy system that can put us on a viable climate stabilization path. This economy-wide investment project will generate millions of jobs engaged both directly and indirectly in creating a new energy infrastructure. This in turn will open opportunities to revive union organizing that can deliver high quality jobs and better living standards, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Robert Pollan's extremely enthusiastic evocation of the New Deal is completely characteristic of left liberals in the US, and it is completely at odds with the real historical record, which is much more troublesome and much less left wing than Bob Pollan would like us to think. So let me just briefly recount what happened. I mean, when Roosevelt took power, I think March 6th, not actually positive the exact day, the US economy had come to a virtual standstill. The banking sector had completely shut down. Banks were closing their doors. There was, in effect, a bank strike. And the economy was at a total standstill. It was the absolute nadir of the collapse. And so it was kind of good for Roosevelt because it meant that Roosevelt was starting at the lowest possible level, and therefore whatever he did would look good because there really was only one way to go, given that the economy had bottomed out, and that was up. And Roosevelt, faced with a wholesale price collapse and a crisis of overproduction, essentially strove to sort of to cartelize the economy, to create a series of industrial cartels that would limit production and discourage newcomers from entering the field. This is the years when we actually saw dairy farmers dumping milk at a time when people were starving in the streets. And children were going hungry for lack of milk. But dairy farmers were dumping milk, pouring it out on the ground because they couldn't afford to bring it to market for one reason. And number two, by reducing supply, they hoped to stabilize prices. But it didn't work at all because prices continued to plunge for the entire 1929 to 1933 period. And even afterwards, even into 1935 and 36, efforts to pump up prices through the technique of cartelization, creating industrial cartels, really was unsuccessful. They were subsequently declared illegal, unconstitutional by the US Supreme Court. But in a sense, it really didn't matter because it was quite clear those cartels were not doing what they were supposed to do. I just want to emphasize that that just as FDR sought to cartelize the US economy, Hitler at the same time was trying to do the same thing to the German economy for the same reason. The Nazis created 13 industrial estates quote unquote, covering all branches of industry. And they were in effect government supervised compulsory cartels. So it was basically a Rooseveltian strategy carried out to a greater extent, but still in essence, recognizably the same. Um, uh, Roosevelt also created a civilian works program called the Civilian Conservation Corps, as Hitler created a civilian works program as well. Um, uh, Both programs were under the control of the military. The Germans, of course, the German approach, of course, is extremely militaristic, in which workers employed in the program are required to snap to attention, salute, etc. And efforts to accomplish similar things in the United States brought about a public backlash, and the military was forced to back off. But still, the military element in the CCC was extremely important, and the idea is that the idea was to take young unemployed workers and give them a smattering of military training while putting them to work, and that was the common idea in the U.S. as well as the idea in Germany. When the Supreme Court struck down the various cartel efforts by Roosevelt, the Democrats hit back with a what was called the Wagner Labor Act, an attempt for the first time to legalize mass industrial organizing. And labor hailed it as essentially as its Magna Carta. But also, what's very important to keep in mind is that the Wagner Act was much less much less liberating than it seemed at the time, because it essentially imposed a very complex, all-embracing system of labor law on unions that freed them for a while, protected them for a while, but after World War II would also have an increasingly suffocating effect, in which unions found themselves more and more legally constrained and less able to operate independently vis-a-vis the bourgeois state. And so, and the Nazis, while of course smashing unions, also instituted a system of labor courts that was not entirely dissimilar from the courts that the Wagner Act created. I also wanted to stress the similarities in terms of urbanization policy. FDR was fiercely anti-urban. He was a Jeffersonian and therefore believed that true democracy was only to be found in the countryside. He once said that only in the country did a family have a chance to establish a real home in the traditional American sense. He wanted to, his goal was actually to empty out the cities. One of his top aides, a man named Rexford Tugwell, said that my idea was to go just outside centers of population, pick up cheap land, build whole communities, entice people into them, and then go back into the cities, tear down entire slums and make parks out of them. So this pretty much sums up the anti-urban, pro-rural strategy policy of the New Deal of the FDR administration. And the reason it's important is, number one, is the cities were seen as dangerous because, among other things, they were centers of labor unrest, and therefore the Roosevelt administration wanted to defuse the cities and essentially defuse labor by shipping workers out into the bucolic countryside. That's important because after the war, of course, American suburbanization would take flight, and a whole new kind of civilization would be created, based revolving around the single-family home, the private automobile, the front lawn, the backyard barbecue, the patio, etc. These would come to define American life and combine and define a whole new manner of consumerism and a whole new political attitude as well. And it's very important to stress that that Hitler was actually of the same mind. Just as Roosevelt believed that the countryside was the only place where an American family could establish a real home in the traditional American sense, Hitler saw the countryside, saw the peasantry as the foundation and life source of the German nation, the counterbalance to communist madness, and the source of national identity. And he also wanted to empty out the cities and ruralize the working class population, where FDR said that his goal was to get unemployed youth off the city street corners. Hitler said that his goal was to keep unemployed young men from, quote, rotting helplessly in the streets. So their policies were really very much very similar in certain respects. And of course, there's also the question of race. I mean, Hitler's anti-Semitism obviously is obviously well known. But the question of racism in the United States under the New Deal is much less well known. For example, in 1936, Franklin Roosevelt refused to back an anti-lynching bill that had been introduced in Congress. Now, an anti-lynching bill means that it would simply would have given the federal government power to intercede in Southern lynchings. And Southern lynchings were a bizarre public ritual in which Black, usually almost invariably Black men, young Black men, who were accused of some kind of anti-white offense, would be, the lynching would be announced days in advance, believe it or not. The law enforcement officials who were elected would stand by, and then crowds would gather as a posse broke into the local jail, dragged out the young Black man in question, tortured him for hours, and then finally hung him from a rope, while hundreds, at times even thousands of people would laugh and jeer and applaud. In Waco, Texas, for example, in 1912, I believe, a young Black man who was accused of murder was beaten for 2 hours in a public square before a crowd of as many as 10,000 people, was coated with oil and then raised and lowered by a chain over an open burning fire for 2 hours. A photographer took pictures of the proceedings and had postcards printed up, which people in Waco then mailed to their friends and relatives out of town to show them the good time they had had. Now, the federal government stood by when this happened. And the anti-lynching bill that was introduced in 1936 would merely have given the federal government authority to step in and prevent these atrocities. But Roosevelt refused to support it because under the strange rules of the US Senate, Southern Democrats controlled the key committees, and his social program would have been dead in the water if he had tried to stop lynchings and had thereby um, uh, alienated Southern Democratic support. So Roosevelt refused to back an anti-lynching bill. To me, this is obviously a profound crime on his part. Roosevelt, in his attempt to get the private housing market restarted, created something called an agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And the Homeowners Loan Corporation stepped in to guarantee individual home mortgages. But in so doing, it drew up standards for what kind of mortgages it would support and what kinds of neighborhoods were deemed worthy of investment. And lo and behold, the neighborhoods that got the top marks were neighborhoods that were entirely white and Christian. And neighborhoods with Jews were rated lower, and neighborhoods with any kind of significant Black population were rated lowest of all. For example, in St. Louis, Missouri, which is now a very heavily Black city and profoundly impoverished, the HOLC expressed repeated concern about the, quote, rapidly increasing Negro population, which it believed rendered it ineligible for federal-backed mortgages. In Brooklyn, a borough of New York City, the presence of a single Black family was enough to render the entire block ineligible for federally backed mortgages. So this had the effect, once suburbanization got underway, of essentially radically segregating US society in the North, not in the South. In the North, in the 1920s, cities were integrated, neighborhoods were integrated, whites and Blacks rubbed shoulders in the streets. 20 years later, 30 or 40 years later, Northern society was far more segregated because the great bulk of suburbanites who benefited from federally backed mortgages lived in neighborhoods where there wasn't a Black person for miles around. They would live their entire life never seeing a Black person, who were essentially confined to increasingly impoverished inner cities. So we think of FDR as a great liberal, but yet FDR probably did more to advance housing segregation than certainly any president before him, and very possibly more than any president after him. So this is what the New Deal wrought. And essentially, I'm always appalled when I see left liberals sort of uncritically applauding the New Deal. Finally, just moving on, the FDR also poured resources into highway construction while leaving railroads in an increasingly parlous state, so that by the 1950s, the American rail network, once the best in the world, was rapidly shrinking. Railroad companies were going backwards, rail ridership was plunging, and America was being turned very rapidly into a country of suburban living, private automobile driving, middle-class people. And this process began under the New Deal, with which devoted much of its resources to highway construction, and in 1944 created the first plans for what would eventually become the National Highway System, one of the greatest public works projects in history, which essentially was devoted to covering the U.S. with state-of-the-art modern highways, which were designed to feed the needs of the emerging new suburbs. And I must point out, of course, that Hitler had the same goal. I mean, Hitler created the Autobahnen. He also, of course, unveiled the Volkswagen, what we call the Volkswagen Beetle or Bug, which was going to be a worker's car that would bring the miracle of private transport to the working class. That never got off the ground, essentially, because the Volkswagen plant was forced to quickly abandon civilian production and gear itself up for military production. But the point is that Hitler had the same goal, essentially. Now, I'm not trying to argue here that Hitler was that Roosevelt was a Nazi, because he clearly wasn't. He clearly was a liberal in the classic political sense. He eventually emerged as a leader of the Allies, the Allied anti-Nazi effort. But it's very important to stress that both Germany and the US were capitalist economies, which were reacting to the economic crisis of 1929 to 33 in broadly similar ways. And that Roosevelt was able to do it much better, much more effectively, because for various political and geographic reasons. I mean, Nazi Germany was hemmed in. As we all know, Hitler had no, had a thirst for Lebensraum. There was nowhere for Nazi Germany to expand to. The U.S. Was in very different straits. The U.S. Was isolated in the Western Hemisphere. It had a huge imperial backyard in Latin America. There was no problem expanding internationally, or there was still, plenty of space left for domestic expansion as well. So Hitler, FDR did not remotely face the same imperial problems that Hitler did. And therefore Hitler was forced to adopt a much more radical solution than FDR was. FDR was therefore able to remain within the bounds of liberal capitalism, where of course Hitler was unable to. American production was much higher. The working class was actually motorized in the 19 teens and 20s. I mean, even the most oppressed steel worker actually had a family car, something that workers in Europe could barely even contemplate. There's the very funny story is in 1939, John Steinbeck's book, The Grapes of Wrath, depicted displaced farmers, homeless peasants wandering around the country. And of course, they traveled by car. And the story is that when Hollywood made a film version in 1941, I believe, starring Henry Fonda, and it was shown in the Soviet Union, but quickly yanked because the Soviet people, Soviet film goers, were astonished that America was so rich that even wandering peasants had automobiles, whereas in the Soviet Union, wandering peasants were lucky to have shoes. So the pressures on the U.S. were much less. The U.S. bourgeois regime was not up against the wall in any sense the way the German bourgeois regime was, and therefore it could opt for a much more moderate and non-radical solution than the Germans could, which is why, of course, Hitler, launched into a frenzy of militarism. It's also worth noting that whereas FDR increased the US national debt by 50%, Hitler increased the German national debt by fourfold, or is it fivefold? Fourfold. So essentially, Hitler's fiscal policies were 8 times as radical as FDR's policies were. And the Marxist historian Tim Mason has this concept of I think he calls it flight forward, where the Hitler was essentially forced to declare war in order to escape the growing financial crisis that was taking shape back home in Germany. The only way he could escape that crisis is by launching a war of plunder, which would bring wealth back into Germany. And ironically, FDR did not launch a war of plunder in the same sense, obviously. But it was the war that brought the U.S. out of the Depression. The 1937 crash was quite devastating, and set the U.S. recovery back. The New Deal by that point was completely dead, and FDR essentially had adopted new and more conservative policies, and brought Republicans into his cabinet. And only in 1939 to 1940, when the war began and the U.S. began gearing up for war production, did the U.S. economy begin its epic takeoff. And that was the start of the long boom, which in the U.S. would persist into the late 60s or early 70s. A great 30-year boom, which was completely transformative, obviously. So just summing up, let me emphasize that there's far more in common between FDR's New Deal and Hitler's Nazi program that left liberals seem to realize. The U.S. was a bourgeois economy, struggling to recover from the devastation of 1929 to 33, and adopted very similar policies to those of the Germans. Those policies were cartelization, growing racism, deurbanization, a switch from rail to private auto transport, and the development out in the suburbs of a completely new lifestyle and a completely new mode of capitalist consumption. It didn't work in Germany, obviously, because Hitler's militarism led to a catastrophe. In which Germany was all but destroyed by the Soviet Union, the Soviet worker state, and the Nazis were torn up by their roots, and the year zero arrived in Germany thanks to the Red Army. But it works in the United States because American resources industrial resources were so much greater. Its geographic advantages were also far greater. It's a liberal heritage that counts for something as well, of course, though I wouldn't want to exaggerate that factor. But the U.S. was therefore able to succeed in essentially restabilizing capitalism and putting it on a new footing. So what Hitler was unable to do, and ended up destroying his own country in the process, the U.S. succeeded in doing, so that the U.S. society that emerged after the war amid the great post-war burst of prosperity ended up looking very different than it had been before, but very different in that it was privatistic, segregated, racist, increasingly militaristic as the period wore on, and revolving around an highly atomized lifestyle based around the suburban home, the private automobile, the purposeful destruction of communal life in favor of an individual life built around the the family home and the television set, etc. So so that, I guess, really sort of sums it up. But the point is to adopt a much more critical view of the New Deal, and to recognize that unlike that contrary to people like Bob Pollan or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the idea of somehow creating a second New Deal, which would green the U.S. economy, solve the problem of global warming, bring a new burst of world peace, et cetera, while also creating high-paying jobs, that this viewpoint is completely ahistorical. It has no basis in fact. It's politically implausible in the extreme, and the more the U.S. left clings to this dream, the more dead-ended it will wind up being. So that's it.
Okay, thanks, thanks, Daniel. Some very interesting points there, particularly your conclusion about the illusions that are around about the New Deal. I think those illusions go far beyond the United States. I think there are many people on the liberal left in Europe, particularly in Britain, who have some of those illusions. Your reference to the Grapes of Wrath is quite interesting. It's quite widely read, or it was widely read, and I think it still appears as a set book on some English literature syllabuses. And in the film version, perhaps more so, there's a lot of pro-New Deal propaganda when they get to California and go to the work camp and so on and so on. So some of those sort of myths still endure. I've got a couple of questions which have come in on the question and answer box, so I'm going to go through those, Daniel, if you just sort of note them. Felicity Demotta asks an interesting question, I think. She says, do you see similarities with the British Labour government in 1945? And she says that it's a form of national socialism, considering the British Empire and colonialism and so on. And I think there is an interesting point about the sort of prestige of Keynesianism and intervention that that the New Deal seems to bring in. There's another question which I think is really about the 19th century, but it refers to the term robber barons. And the questioner Faraz asks you, what do you understand by that term? I think it comes from the Gilded Age of the 19th century and is less about this period. Okay. Also, again, not really on topic, but I will ask it, but I think it's really one that would have been better put to David Broder last week. And it's about, I suppose, the international influence of the New Deal, and whether you know anything about whether Mussolini developed New Deal policies. But we did have some discussion on that last week. I can remember David referring to Mussolini's economic policy. Okay, we've got a number of questions now. So I'll take Matthew Jones first of all.
If I unmute myself.
Yeah, we can hear you, Matthew.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that the thing is, I think, I mean, to be brief, unfortunately, I have my Labour Party AGM in a few minutes, but the thing is that I think there are certain things which you know, some of which Dan's outlined, which are critical here, and some of which I think he's left out. I think first of all, obviously, is the willingness of the US ruling class, in fact, its enthusiasm for violence against the oppressed and the working class. I mean, its positive glorying in the use of violence, particularly lethal violence against the working class and the organised working class in particular, which of course is now evident, of course, in the fact that it now employs a police force which is quite happy to shoot at least 3 people a day or kill at least 3 people a day, and probably more, as a matter of course. And of course, under conditions in which, where it's facing an uprising by its own working class, which it has done in several times, of course, it's quite prepared to use even greater forms of violence. And of course, you get things like the use of up to the use of bomber aircraft against miners in Virginia, the Battle of Bear Mountain. There's no holds barred in some of these things. Against its own population. I think the second thing about it is its, obvious use of racism to split the working class. The comrade outlined, the whole methods of segregation, which you can still see if you go into any US city today. They're incredibly segregated. And of course, that's a method of splitting the working class. And of course, it's central to the operation of the Democratic Party itself. Particularly, the point of which he's talking. I'm not surprised, because obviously the Democrats actually ran the South. They were the slavery party. Not surprised at all that FDR was not in favour of anything being done about lynching, because it was members of his party who were doing it, and it's that method that implied all the way through. And it's still being applied. It's still being used. The American society is still profoundly racist. The other thing, of course, is that the thing that he's left out really is the militancy of the working class, particularly actually in the 20s and more so in the 30s. And you can go through the whole series of struggles, whether that's coming from the IWW after during and after the war, and then through into the building of the CIO. This book. Which unfortunately is very difficult to get hold of. It was published in '64 by Art Price, who was a participant, a member of the American SWP at the time, and published it a few months before he died. But he was a participant, particularly in the foundation of the United Automobile Workers Union, and it outlines the whole piece of that the building of that movement, which is incredibly important. Although, of course, obviously, under conditions in which it was able to be controlled, but with the use of the union bureaucracy and particularly also the Communist Party, and then of course used itself from the 50s onwards as another instrument of American imperialism. But it doesn't deprive the importance of that struggle. And the other, I think the point the comrade makes is correct in terms of saying, that actually, of course, the working class does have access to things like cars. You get the 1933 textile strike, which is a motorised strike. It's able to run a national, these poor textile workers, relatively isolated, relatively poorly organised, are able to run a national strike because they can drive cars from one place to another and summon their fellow workers out on strike. Which they did very successfully. Unfortunately, they didn't win the strike, but it's an amazing thing. Price describes it as this great crusade of workers, going from one textile mill to the other and calling out their fellow workers, against the bosses. And of course, it again led to incredible outbreaks of violence, including in places like there's a famous massacre in Rhode Island, against workers in the textile mill, who were shot down by the National Guard. But it's then the building of this mass organisation of industrial workers, and particularly car workers, and then of course obviously the efforts of the SWP to build the Teamsters coming out of Minneapolis, whereas they described, there's another series of books in which they describe the whole basis of coming from, starting off as shoveling coal in coal yards to running a mass truckers union and warehouse union across 12 states in a matter of a few years. It wasn't just a long process. It took you were talking, this thing was developing over months, and running huge battles, massive battles against the cops, against armed elements of the ruling class. and there was absolutely no holds barred, and that was how those people were having to organise. And you can go through that across the industry, and it actually develops into, as Price outlines, actually the whole bit in 1946, where there is the biggest strike in US history, which is all but removed from all textbooks and history and so on and so forth, in which the auto steel and coal come out and strike, in demanding wages and conditions, and obviously the success of that movement is incredibly important, and it's then, as you say, I mean, in terms of like how is that being controlled through the efforts of Roosevelt, who, I mean, on occasions get quite desperate about this, and of course the use of the Stalinists as another method of control of that critical movement, and I think it's these sort of things, that we can draw, because I mean, I don't think, from the working class point of view, that the experience of the 1930s in the US is totally negative. In fact, there's very large numbers of positive and useful lessons from it. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. Just two further comrades in this section, Anthony Brain and then Tony Greenstein.
Hello, comrades. I'll just speak. If I go too fast, tell me. I think Matthew Jones has made a very important contribution tonight in terms of talking about the role of the Trotskyists, and some of the points I was going to raise. But there's a lot of people breaking from Leninism, and the important point Matthew made tonight was how ruthless the state is. You had, for example, a few weeks ago, what's his name? Thomas Chenley Evans saying, you don't have, it's faded into a certain extent, but you don't have to take up a ruthless state. How naive was it? The British state's ruthless. But to James B. Cannon, when he wrote Struggle for a Proletarian Party, said the state is the most ruthless state in the world. But I also, Matthew didn't say this, but maybe Dan can come in. My dad was in the Canadian Trotsky movement from 1956 to 66. And he said he met a lot of the American SWP leaders. He was very close to Joseph Hanson. And worked with him to the early 70s. But he was the most serious leadership outside the Bolshevik Party. I also reason they wouldn't have got away with fascism, partly because there's a very serious case in the United States. But that's what background information on that. But I think capitalism just about survived the Second World War. I mean, it was Schacht who developed all the, as Matthew said in one comment, they developed the program to save capitalism. There could have been, if they hadn't gone to war, there could have been strikes breaking out with inflation. That's why Schacht, I would have thought years ago, he resigned the head of the German bank. And that's why Goering replaced a lot of the banks. But I think the important thing is, as I said in the comments, both Roosevelt and Hitler saved the banks through different methods. Both spelled them out. I mean, Hitler was a Keynesian, but one was through liberal bourgeois democracy, making concessions to the trade union bureaucracy and with repression. Whereas Hitler destroyed the labor movement. It's important to see those. Devin Trotsky talked about New Deal fascism, both in the transitional program and in defense of New Deal fascism and the New Deal with different ways of ruling for capitalism. But also go see their different differences. Every regime is capitalist in a capitalist society, but they're all different forces. In a bourgeois democracy, they make concessions. For example, to stop the Labour Party in France, they made the concessions in the New Deal to stop the workers breaking. Problem was the Stalins, the Social Democrats were in government. They got concessions, and Trotsky is supposed to have been in government on principle. But then that was how they did it. We called for a break from the Popular Front, but that's a slight difference in the New Deal because that's to work with the working class parties, however, opportunistically. And fascism destroys all working class organizations. So but I think there is a radicalization as people more communist among the youth than there were in that period. But it hadn't been for American capitalism after the war. I mean, in the 30s, most people did. It said in the Cold War, they just had enough to eat to have a get by and get a house on their head and eat. After the second big end, and there was big strikes going on, but hadn't been for the boom, capitalism wouldn't have survived. But It's that life, I mean, no chance you've got a big question about whether humanity is going to survive with COVID, the environmental crisis, and nuclear weapons. And we don't know when the next wars are going to break out. That's why we need to build the big anti-war movement. There's a big radicalization in America. The Black Lives Matter movement saved humanity, and the American Trotskyists are coming back. We've got finishing Trotsky. I don't know if Dan knows this. 500,000 people who shared Trotsky saying we follow Trotsky, Hitler could have got smashed. And John G. writes pamphlets in Persian in Iran, where he's fashioning how to fight, circulating in Britain. And over 500,000 people are reading it, all in the intellectual selves in America. It's a big radicalization. It could be American Trotsky could be that big than it was with the SWP. There's big possibilities. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks, Anthony. I'll just take Tony Greenstein, and then I'll let Dan reply, and then we'll bring in Steve at the beginning of the next round. Okay, Tony.
Yeah, thanks. Just a couple of real questions, really. Thank you for your talk, which I found incredibly interesting. Just a few points. Firstly, of course, you made a lot of comparisons between Roosevelt and Hitler, but the main difference between them was that Hitler's was a fascist regime, which aimed and completed the destruction of the German workers' movement. That wasn't the strategy of Roosevelt. But although both followed, you say, the same, presumably would describe it as Keynesian economic program. You also mentioned the rejection of the urban environment and moving out to the suburbs, and the idealization of the family dwelling in the country. And Hitler, of course, did have that under Walter Dahr, the agricultural policy. But I suppose a difference, certainly ideologically, was that Dahr's philosophy, which never really got implemented in Germany in practice, was part of the Nazis' blood and soil philosophy, which, correct me if I'm wrong, Roosevelt didn't subscribe to that, although, as you say, there were many similarities. Hitler in particular looked at the American eugenicist movement as a justification for his own policies on eliminating hereditary diseases and so on. I was interested, maybe, what was Roosevelt's justification for rejecting the lynching bill? That's not clear, but I'd be quite interested to know. And finally, what is your own opinion on the Grapes of Wrath, which is a classic American novel of the Depression, although I think it was published around the beginning of the Second World War. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. And all right, Dan, you've got quite a lot to go at there.
Yeah, I really do. Okay. There are similarities between, obviously, it's between post-war policy by the British Labour Party and the post-war policy of the U.S. Democrats, who still had power until 1952. But the big difference is in the comparative economic status. I mean, America was even more powerful as of 1945 than it had been before the war. I think what is it? It had 50% of global manufacturing capacity by that point, 20% more than it had in the 1920s. It was the far and away the dominant economic power. Its resources were seemingly unlimited. And so therefore, America had the power to reshape society, to suburbanize, petty bourgeoisify, to take a leading role internationally, militarily, to emerge as the leader of the great anti-communist struggle, where obviously the British Labour Party could only sort of hover in America's shadow, attach itself to America as a junior partner, and could just simply was incapable of projecting power in any way that's remotely comparable. What the joke was when Keynes returned from Washington from economic talks in Washington, in I think 1946, a reporter asked him if it was true that Washington was going to turn Britain into the 49th U.S. state, and Keynes replied, "No such luck." America was just in a different class. I mean, bear in mind, World War II was a very happy time for America. It was a time of full employment, a very strong income growth, a sense of pulling together in the war effort, but it's remembered as a very happy period. and obviously, this is worlds apart from the way the war was experienced in the rest of the world. So that to me sort of sums up the difference between the U.S. and British plights after 1945. But yes, both countries did extol Keynesian interventionism. Kevin, I think, raised the question of the robber barons. The robber barons were the industrialists. The term applies to the industrialists of the 1880s and 90s, when America was just emerging as the new industrial colossus. The story goes that John D. Rockefeller, who made his money in oil, was a billionaire at a time when the most expensive hotel room in New York rented for $2 a night. So that gives an idea of the extraordinary wealth and power of the robber barons. And I think it was Kevin who brought up the question of comparisons between the New Deal and Mussolini. In the 1920s, Mussolini was a very popular figure in the US, as he was a popular figure elsewhere in the world as well. I mean, in 1926, Churchill gave a speech, I think it's 1926, in which he praised Mussolini to the skies and said if he was an Italian, he would have joined Mussolini's party, because Mussolini's party was the only way of saving Italy. And in the U.S., Mussolini was very popular as well. In 1933, the fascist press in Italy praised Roosevelt's economic policies very strongly. In fact, both the fascist press in Italy and the Nazi press in Germany in 1933 applauded when essentially FDR pulled the rug out from under an international conference called to stabilize the capitalist economies, because both Hitler and Mussolini saw FDR as essentially pursuing the same kinds of policies of nationalism, national autarky, etc. So this is just another example of how similar these bourgeois parties were across the fascist liberal political divide. Matthew Jones, you're right. I mean, I certainly should have emphasized more the question of violence that was employed by the U.S. ruling class, and it was clearly in a league by itself. I mean, essentially, the U.S. had the most violent labor relations of any industrial country, with the sole exception of Tsarist Russia. The national, state and national militias, militaries were called out hundreds of times to smash strikes. Workers were shot down by the scores in these industrial battles. In 1919, there was a coal miners strike in West Virginia. And by the way, coal miners in West Virginia were treated far worse than Welsh coal miners. The Welsh coal miners had far more legal rights than West Virginia coal miners do. The West Virginia coal bosses were essentially unrestrained in a way that Welsh coal miners, coal mine owners would have liked to have been, but didn't have the opportunity. But in a strike in West Virginia in 1919, Both sides were armed to the teeth, and I think that the figure is that 2 million bullets were fired in the course of an industrial battle persisting for only a matter of days. So it gives you an idea. And Billy Mitchell, the great architect of military air power, actually wanted to use a military aircraft to bomb the miners' camps in that struggle. He was denied permission though. And yes, I mean, racism is obviously the importance of racism in U.S. political development can't be overemphasized. But the point is the idea that the U.S. actually wound up more segregated as a concept, as a result of Rooseveltian housing, transportation, and real estate policies is very, very important. I mean, the new society that emerged after the war was actually more segregated, in many ways more racist, North and South, than it had been previously. And this is not due to some kind of inherent, genetic tendency in America and among Americans to racism. It's the result of government policies by a bourgeois state, which was trying to create a new mode of highly atomized suburban consumption revolving around the private car, the private home, and the segregated, sterilized, depoliticized middle-class suburb. Anthony Brain brings up the question of the role of the U.S. Also before I forget, Matthew also raised the question of U.S. working class militancy, and he's absolutely correct, of course. The spring of 1934 saw three general strikes break out, all of them led by Marxist or semi-Marxist parties. There was a longshore strike in San Francisco, led by the Communist Party, an auto strike in Toledo, Ohio, led by something called the American Workers' Party. And then, of course, there was the general strike in Minneapolis, led by the Truckers Union, which was led by the Trotskyist movement. And America during the war became the center of global Trotskyism. But I just must stress that the Trotskyist movement that emerged after the war was one that was increasingly bureaucratized, sclerotic, kind of mechanistic in its application of old pre-war formulas to the rapidly evolving new political circumstances of the post-war period, and that the U.S. Socialist Workers' Party essentially shattered in the early to the mid-60s when some of its most important militants left to establish new movements. And then I guess that I say this in response to Anthony Brain's comments as well. As for Tony Greenstein, of course, Hitler was a fascist and FDR was not a fascist. But my point is that FDR didn't have to be a fascist. I mean, he had maneuvering room within a bourgeois liberal framework that Hitler just didn't have. So as a consequence, he could afford to be liberal, and he could afford to be politically creative in creating a new mode of capitalist production and consumption in a way that the Germans couldn't. So it's very important to keep in mind those special political, economic, and geographic circumstances that allowed the U.S. to find a way out of the dilemma, whereas the Germany was just brought to rack and ruin as a result of a similar effort. FDR, the Americans didn't make an issue out of blood and soil because America is an immigrant state, which was more concerned with melding together people from various parts of Europe who came together to move to America. But America did develop a similar ideology, not of blood and soil, but of the Wild West, the pioneers, the cowboys and Indians, etc., in which a myth of conquest was developed, and the Americans proved themselves in subjugating the Wild West, and that became, especially after the war, that became a very important part of a post-war U.S. ideology. And on a personal note, I might note that my parents had a treasured photograph of me and my brother in 1953 or 54, and we're both dressed up in cowboy outfits with Mach 6 guns and cowboy hats, etc. And that was the American ideal that was being expressed at the time. And as for FDR's justification for rejecting the lynching bill, he was quite frank. He couldn't afford to do it because Southern Democrats controlled the key committees in the Senate, the upper house of the U.S. Congress, and that if he had if he had supported a lynching bill, they would have retaliated by killing his social legislation. And as a result, and by the way, the New Deal I didn't mention, but the New Deal made great concessions to the Dixiecrats, as they were known, by exempting agricultural and domestic workers from its provisions, because those parts of the workforce were largely Black. So under Southern Democratic pressure, FDR, made sure, agreed that Black people should not reap any of the benefits of the New Deal, and that discrepancy continued after the war as well, when Blacks were shut out of the new suburbs because of racial restrictions and mortgages, which the federal government did not object to. So the federal government, in its most liberal phase, took extreme measures to undercut the position of Black Americans. And and as for Grapes of Wrath, I mean, it's obviously a very powerful novel. It's one of the great novels of American literature, and American literature is a great literature, by the way. And Steinbeck, it's a real achievement. But it's just important to keep in mind that we can't just make too much of that mythology. We can't swallow it whole. We've got to have a more sophisticated, nuanced understanding of what capitalist development was like in that period. That's it. Over to you, Kevin.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. I've got one more comrade who wants to come in to speak, and then I've got a few questions in the question and answer box, which I'll put to you, Daniel. Okay, Steve, if you'd like to come in now.
Yeah, enjoyed the talk. It's very informative. As I'm sitting here waiting and listening to all the answers, I'm starting to wonder whether I've got anything new to answer or contribute now, because I kind of agree with a lot of the points that are being made. But I'll see if I can take a point, because obviously you've got this period where 1928 to 32, this period of where capitalism is in a crisis unevenly across the world. But capitalism is also socialized in the sense of being monopolized into large concentrations of capital. And so what you've got is a crisis of the free market. And the only way you're going to be able to do something about that is if the state steps in. So in a certain sense, state capitalism is a response to that crisis. And you can therefore start to link together responses in many different countries because of the role of the state in taking things into ownership, investing, debt finance, state planning, spending in all the ways that we know, the autobahns and the network of roads in America and so on and so forth. All these things are all common And we can also see them in 2008 also, because in a way that's what happened in the financial crisis there. We had a massive increase in the state taking over the debts of capital and putting them onto the books, really, again, another massive way. The state steps in to save capitalism from collapse. And so that's what you can see there in that process. And of course, military spending has got to be part of that, because that's another way. Military spending and the move towards war is also part of it. And I think comrades have stressed that I would count the Soviet Union as in the story as well. I mean, they're all different: Germany, America, Soviet Union, because Germany and America are advanced capitalist countries, whereas the Soviet Union is still largely a peasant economy. So there are big differences in where they are. And I think comrades have said this, the big difference is to see the role of the working class in all of this, whereas in Germany, the working class was made already very strong in the late 20s and early 30s because of the Russian Revolution, and therefore fascism was the only way that the capitalist class could carry out a policy of state capitalism, by crushing the working class first of all. Whereas in America, that was not the situation. The working class didn't need to be crushed, although, as comrades have said, there was a stronger working class movement there as well, and quite strong battles. Again, the position of the working class in the Soviet Union was different again, because of Stalinism that had come. So I think if we're comparing these as different versions of state capitalism, which have arisen because of different positions of the working class and the working class movements in all of these different countries, really we have to think, well, what is it about bureaucratic state capitalism? Where is the other policy to that? And I think then you've got to start going over to the question of democracy. What was a democratic program? What was it the case that we can merely the state can take over capitalism in the way that Roosevelt did, in the way that Stalin or Hitler did, or has there got to be a democratic answer to that? And that seems to me is where the argument goes, because then you can link in the 1945 social contract as well, that came out of the war. So you could probably count Italy in this. You could probably count Japan in this as well, as different forms of state capitalism in response to the crisis of capitalism to save it. So, yeah, that's maybe I've only said what other people have said. I don't know, but there we go. I have a view to decide. I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I've got no more comrades who want to speak, but what I've got are a number of sort of comments in the question and answer box. So I don't know if you can see those, Daniel, but I'll just read them out so that everybody can see. George Villeneuve asks whether the New Deal didn't help some people, blacks as well as whites, and he comments that that maybe in the armaments industry that there may well have been improved black living standards. I don't know whether you want to comment on that. And then one attendee who we don't have their name says whether Roosevelt's regime was more racist than under President Wilson. And he says, or the question says, certainly the racism was well in place as African Americans moved north or fled the south, only to find a vast mechanism of racism, favoritism to foreign-born migrants, and so on. So I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that question of the sort of racialization there. And then I'm going to add a question of my own, and it's really about the debate in America on the New Deal, Daniel, and the way that the phrase New Deal, the Green New Deal, for example, is a phrase that's used in British social democratic politics. And I think it may even have crept now into the Conservative Party as well. So I wondered whether, just to sort of round up, whether the American left, and I use that really in terms of the Marxist and the authentically socialist left, has come to terms with the New Deal, or whether what we're talking about is really social democrats and indeed left liberals who still want to sort of, in a sense, put themselves in the mainstream that the New Deal is a sort of safe mainstream way of being radical, as it were. But I'm interested that it's still a very potent idea. You know, I'm thinking particularly of the way that Biden's policies are being sort of seen to echo this, although I think they're rather different. Anyway, those are the questions. So if you'd like to just respond, and then you can sum up, and then you can go back to having your holiday.
Sure, of course. Kevin, one question. You mentioned something about the effect of the armaments industry on Black living conditions.
Yes. Yeah, that's a question that someone put. George Villeneuve said, he actually says, Black people did get some benefits from the New Deal, for example, in the armaments industry. It's not it's George's question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fine, I'll get to that. First of all, in regard to Steve Freeman, I don't adhere to the state capitalist theory of Stalinist Russia by any means. I think it was a deformed worker state and a degenerated worker state is the proper technical term. And we see that the development processes were very different. I mean, despite the Stalinist deformations. I mean, Soviet policy was one of terrific urbanization. Instead of pouring money into private cars, the Soviets poured money into rail networks and into subway projects, such as the prestigious Moscow subway project. Now you can take, of course, obviously, you can take issue with how those were done. I mean, the Moscow subways were an especially bloody mess. I mean, thousands of workers lost their lives because the CP was determined to accomplish this prestige project, and avoid getting shot in the head by Stalin if they fell short. But nonetheless, it's important to stress that the Soviets were putting their resources into urban rail development, whereas the Americans were doing the opposite. The Americans and the Germans were doing the opposite, and I think that sort of says something about the basic political dynamics of capitalism, whether liberal or fascist, and communism, and how they view the working class. Roosevelt wanted to disperse the working class. Hitler was terrified of the working class, and the Soviets, despite the Stalinist misleadership, were devoted to building up the working class. So those are two very different factors at work. As to the question as to whether Black people benefited from the New Deal and from the armaments, the arms industry, the arms buildup of World War II, they of course did. To a lesser extent from the New Deal, although they benefited from welfare provisions, unemployment, etc. And the 1930s actually marks the start of the great swing by Black voters from Republicans to Democrats. As hard as it's to believe, I mean, Black Americans voted overwhelmingly Republican through the 1920s and only switched allegiances to the Democrats in the 1930s. And so they were beginning to see benefits, and the post-war period was a time of very strong income growth for Black Americans, and a time of very powerful social advancement. So I don't want to paint a picture that is that is uniformly bleak, or that sort of a one-dimensional portrait of American society as it's completely and unrelentingly racist. But the fact is that the U.S. society that evolved after World War II was more segregated and in many respects more racist than the society was before. Also, I would also emphasize that someone raised the question of whether FDR was more racist than Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a Virginian who actually instituted workplace segregation throughout the federal bureaucracy. The federal bureaucracy was purged of Black employees under Wilson. Wilson, as we know, screened the movie. Oh, what the hell was it called?
Birth of a Nation.
Yeah, Birth of a Nation. In the White House, and the Birth of the Nation is essentially a piece of Ku Klux Klan propaganda, and Wilson not only embraced it, not only screened it, he embraced its ideological message. He was a Virginian, a Southerner, and he believed very much in Southern racial policies. But still, FDR, remodeled the American state. The American state was really minuscule in the 1920s. Total government spending at all levels, federal, state, and local, accounted for just 4% of GDP. It's amazing. FDR, its great expansion began under FDR, but the point is that great expansion was used to actually further segregate the US rather than to reduce segregation. So even though FDR may have been personally more liberal than Woodrow Wilson, in some ways his policies were even worse. I guess that pretty much covers it. And then there's Kevin's point about the current current left liberal usage of the Green New Deal. And yes, there's clearly an attempt by people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to kind of use a familiar image in order to popularize their ideas. And to sort of paint their ideas as firmly within the liberal, democratic, with a capital D, mainstream. And I think that co-thinkers around the world are trying to do the same, arguing that by sort of like creating an American-style, liberal, democratic, capitalist society, that they can accomplish the problems like global warming, et cetera. To me, it's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, essentially, global warming must be attacked through a marshaling of technology, but also of a complete reconstruction of energy policy, of tax policies, et cetera, really a rebuilding of capitalist society. And capitalism can't rebuild itself in that way. It just can't do it. It doesn't have the resources, doesn't have the political abilities, et cetera. Only socialism can accomplish that kind of wholesale transformation that is needed in order to meet the challenge posed by global warming. And I think that any leftists like Bob Pollan who try to sort of cover this up, or to essentially suggest that this kind of socialist mobilization is not required, I think are doing a real disservice to their readers and their followers.
Okay. Oh, thanks very much, Daniel. And I'd like to thank all the other comrades for questions and comments. I'm sure we've all learned a lot this evening, and I think your conclusions, Daniel, were spot on, and will prove very useful for comrades in Britain and elsewhere when we go over these questions, when we meet this sort of politics. Could I just ask if any comrades have got any announcements of forthcoming meetings or demonstrations, anything at all that they'd like to put on? I think we've got a lobby coming up of the NEC on July the 20th, but we'll perhaps have more details near the time. Okay, well, thanks very much, comrades. And next week we're going to look at some of the questions that Dan touched on in terms of Nazi Germany, when I'll be talking about about the implementation of the Nazi program and the nature of the Nazi society in Germany between 1933 and 1939. So thanks very much for everyone coming along. And once again, thank you, Dan, and I'm sure I'll see you again somewhere else soon. Have a good holiday.
Great, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay, bye.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Kevin. Bye.